I always thought my sister chose her career over everything else in life, until her funeral told me a very different story. Growing up, my sister was always the serious one, the one people described as an old soul even when she was barely out of elementary school. I was the one who cried at movies and forgot my keys twice a week, and she was the one who color-coded her calendar and never missed a deadline in her life. She went into law straight out of school, and she worked her way up at the same firm for almost 2 decades. By the time she was in her 30s, she was the kind of person younger associates were genuinely terrified of disappointing. She wore tailored suits even on weekends sometimes, like she never fully turned off whatever version of herself showed up in that office every morning. She never had children, and for most of my adult life, I just assumed that was a choice she'd made, a deliberate trade she'd made without regret. One more decision in a long list of decisions that put her career first. It wasn't until I was in my late 20s that she finally told me the real reason. We were sitting at her kitchen table one evening, and her voice went flat in that way it did whenever she was trying hard not to feel something out loud. She told me she'd been diagnosed with infertility in her early 20s, long before either of us had even started thinking seriously about that part of life. And she said she'd made peace with it a long time ago by throwing herself into work instead. I believed her completely, because it fit so neatly into everything I already thought I knew about her. She was disciplined. She was practical. She'd taken something painful and turned it into fuel for a career most people would kill for. I admired her for that, honestly, even though I sometimes wished she'd let herself be a little softer with me, let herself call just to talk instead of only calling when there was actual news to share. We weren't distant exactly, but we weren't close either, not in the way sisters are supposed to be close in movies, with long phone calls and shared secrets. Holidays, a few phone calls a month, the occasional weekend visit that always felt a little transactional, like we were checking a box rather than really spending time together. I used to joke that she probably scheduled our conversations into 15-minute blocks between meetings, and she'd give me this small, tight smile that told me I wasn't entirely wrong about that. There was one time, a few years back, when I called her on a random Tuesday night just to talk, no real reason, and she seemed distracted the whole call, kept saying she had somewhere to be soon. I remember feeling a little hurt by that, thinking she just didn't have room in her life for anything that wasn't work. I never asked where she was going. I wish now that I had. She passed away suddenly, a heart condition none of us knew she had, and I was the one who had to plan the funeral, because there wasn't really anyone else to do it. No husband, no kids, our parents gone years earlier. It was just me, standing in a funeral home going through paperwork, feeling like I was organizing a business trip for someone who couldn't attend, rather than saying goodbye to my only sibling. I expected a small service. Maybe a handful of coworkers from the firm, a couple of old college friends if they were still in touch with her, which I genuinely wasn't sure of. I picked a modest chapel, ordered a small number of chairs, and figured we'd be finished within the hour. I was wrong almost immediately. People started arriving nearly 45 minutes before the service was even scheduled to begin, and they just kept coming. Young people, mostly, some who looked barely out of their teens, others clearly in their 20s, filing in with a kind of quiet, practiced grief that struck me as strange for people I assumed were just distant acquaintances of hers. Then came adults I didn't recognize at all, including a woman in her 50s who hugged me tightly at the door and said my sister's name like it belonged to someone she'd known intimately for years. By the time the chapel filled completely, and then filled past capacity, with people standing along the back wall and spilling slightly into the hallway, I was doing math in my head that simply didn't add up. My sister worked 60-hour weeks at a law firm. She didn't have this many friends. She barely had time for the few she did have. I sat in the front row, watching stranger after stranger take a seat, feeling less and less like I understood whose funeral I was actually sitting at. A woman in her 40s approached me before the service started, introducing herself as Marlene. She told me she ran a group home for kids aging out of foster care, kids who'd spent years bouncing between placements and had nowhere else to land once they turned 18. I nodded politely, assuming she was there representing some charity my sister had donated to, the kind of thing lawyers sometimes did for tax purposes or just out of a general sense of obligation, Then Marlene said something that stopped me completely. She said my sister had been coming to that group home every single week for 20 years. Not to write a check and leave, but to actually sit with the kids, help them with homework, drive them to job interviews, show up at their high school graduations when nobody else would. She said my sister had personally paid for at least a dozen of those kids to go to college, quietly, never once wanting her name attached to any of it. I asked her if she was sure she had the right person, because the woman she was describing didn't sound anything like the sister I'd grown up with. Marlene pulled out her phone and showed me a photo. My sister was sitting on a worn couch surrounded by teenagers, laughing in a way I honestly hadn't seen from her in years, her tailored blazer traded for a soft cardigan, looking more relaxed than I could ever remember her looking in our own family's living room. One by one, the young people who'd arrived early came up to introduce themselves to me throughout that afternoon. A young man named Derek told me my sister had been the only person who showed up for his court dates, back when he was fighting to get custody of his younger brother. He said she sat in the gallery every single time, never said a word to the judge, just showed up and stayed present through the whole thing. A young woman named Priya told me my sister had taught her how to write a resume, how to interview for jobs, and had co-signed her very first apartment lease when nobody else would. A boy who couldn't have been older than 19 stood up during the service itself, when the officiant opened the floor for anyone who wanted to share a memory. He said my sister was the first adult in his entire life who never once missed a promise she made to him. He said when she told him she'd be there, she was there, every single time, for 11 straight years, since he was 8 years old. His voice cracked halfway through, and an older woman next to him reached over and squeezed his hand while he finished. An older teenager, maybe 17, told me quietly afterward that my sister used to bring homemade lasagna to the group home every few weeks, the same recipe our own mother used to make when we were kids, and that she'd taught 2 of the older girls how to cook it themselves so it would keep going even after she was gone. I hadn't thought about that lasagna recipe in years, and hearing it mentioned by a stranger who loved my sister nearly knocked the wind out of me right there in my seat. I sat in that front row absorbing detail after detail that didn't fit anywhere into the version of my sister I'd built in my head over 30 years of being her sibling. Suddenly the weekends she said she was working made a different kind of sense. The vacations she took alone that she never described in any real detail made sense too. Even that one random Tuesday night when she rushed me off the phone because she had somewhere to be, that made sense now in a way that made my chest ache. After the service, Marlene handed me a small folder, the kind of thing you'd keep receipts in. She told me my sister had asked her, just a few months earlier, to make sure I got it if anything ever happened to her. Inside were photographs I'd never seen before. My sister at birthday parties for kids I'd never heard of. My sister standing beside a young woman in a cap and gown, clearly at a graduation. My sister holding a newborn baby that belonged to one of the young people she'd helped years earlier, a baby who was now, in every way that mattered, the closest thing my sister ever had to a grandchild. There was also a short letter inside, handwritten, clearly written in a hurry between one of those 60-hour work weeks. She wrote that she never told me about this part of her life because she didn't want it to feel like a performance, something she was doing just to be praised or admired by anyone, including me. She said the kids needed someone who showed up because she genuinely wanted to be there, not someone doing it to be seen doing it. She mentioned our mother's lasagna recipe too, said she hoped I didn't mind that she'd shared it, that it felt right somehow to keep passing it forward. She wrote that she loved being my sister, and that she was sorry she never let me see all of her, but that she hoped by leaving me this folder, I'd finally understand that nothing had ever actually been missing from her life at all. Derek found me again near the end of the afternoon, once most of the crowd had thinned out. He asked if I wanted to come by the group home sometime, see the place she'd spent so much of her life in, and meet the people who considered her family in every way that actually mattered. I'd like that, I said, and I meant it more than I'd meant almost anything I'd said that entire long, strange day. She talked about you, you know, he said. Said her sister was the one person in the world she never had to explain herself to. I laughed for the first time since she'd died, a short, surprised sound that caught in my throat halfway through. She explained herself to you plenty, apparently, I said, gesturing down at the folder still in my hands. Derek smiled, the kind of warm, easy smile that belonged to someone who genuinely loved her. Different kind of explaining, he said. Come by Thursday. We do dinner every week there. She never missed it, not once, in 20 whole years. Then I won't either, I said. And for the first time since I'd gotten that phone call about her heart, something in my chest loosened just slightly, like a door opening onto a whole room of my sister's life I never even knew existed, one I finally had a key to, and one I planned on walking through every single Thursday from now on.